in which a bonnet is found, a scholar blunders, and Lord Peter Whimsy delivers a lecture on ecclesiastical millinery. It was not, all things considered, a particularly significant bonnet. It had once been pink of that watery clerical sort that suggests either an anemic schoolgirl or a retired bishop's niece with views on the propriety of waistcoats in the pulpit. Now, weathered and spotted, it had turned a ghostly grey, with fraying lace that fluttered indecisively in the coastal wind. It was discovered by Miss Trott, formerly of the Women's Royal Naval Service, now of the Wetherall Ladies' Temperance Reading Circle, pinned unceremoniously to a gorse bush near the edge of the limestone cliffs. "I always said this coast was unlucky," Miss Trott told the constable. "First the curate drowns, now this." What the "this" was, precisely, became clearer some 2 hours later when a body was discovered in the vestry of St. Simon's, a tidy Norman affair with an unbecoming new roof and a bell that rang sharp on overcast mornings. The corpse in question, that of Miss Claudia Snaith, spinster, ecclesiastical embroiderer, and, according to the vicar, an ornament to the parish both in deed and in doctrine, had been found sprawled in a most inconvenient position across the stone floor. Her arms were twisted in what the vicar's wife termed an irreverent attitude, and a quantity of altar brass had been knocked aside with some force. She had not, it appeared, gone quietly to her reward. That was on a Thursday. By Friday, the local inspector, a worthy man, though with unexamined views on bonnet ribbons, had declared it a regrettable accident, a fainting fit perhaps, with tragic consequences. Miss Snaith was, after all, of a nervous type. The brass had merely been in the way. On Saturday, the matter took a more inconvenient turn when it was observed that Miss Snaith's keys had been removed, and with them access to the sacristy safe, containing, among more ordinary treasures, a parcel of recently donated Georgian silver and a sealed folio of church documents dating from 1631. It was on Sunday that Lord Peter Whimsy, having accepted an invitation to a perfectly dreadful house party at nearby Dunningfold, arrived, as he said, to see the sermon, hear the scandal, and avoid both by sitting in the back pew. "I say," he remarked to no one in particular as he leaned over the vestry threshold and regarded the chalk outline on the stones, "if that's how they're aligning the cruciform now, the church is in more trouble than I thought." The vicar, hovering behind him with a worried smile, adjusted his collar. "You'll forgive us, Lord Peter," he said, "but it's been a difficult few days. Miss Snaith was, well, not universally loved, perhaps, but certainly respected. And that bonnet—" Whimsy turned, his monocle catching a slant of light from the stained glass window depicting St. Sebastian in unnervingly aesthetic agony. "Ah, yes. The bonnet. Tell me, vicar, do you often find millinery in the shrubbery of your parish?" "Certainly not. But it was hers. We're almost sure." "Oh, no," said Whimsy gently, as if remarking upon the decline of Latin verse in modern schooling. "The bonnet was never hers." The vicar blinked. "But Miss Trott, she knew Miss Snaith's wardrobe intimately." "Indeed, I dare say she did. Women of a certain age always make a profession of other people's wardrobes." "But Miss Snaith," Whimsy said, drifting toward the font and laying an idle finger upon the carved rim, "would not have worn rose-colored lace, even in her youth. She belonged, you see, to that formidable subset of Anglican spinsterhood that clings to black bombazine and grey flannel as signs of spiritual sobriety. Her idea of coquetry was a second pew cushion." The vicar said nothing. Whimsy, sighing, turned back to the crime scene, and for a moment, just a moment, his face ceased to be ironic and became unreadably intent. He knelt beside the edge of the flagstone, tapping it lightly with his knuckles. "No," he murmured. "The bonnet belonged to someone else. The question is, who left it there and why? And why would Miss Snaith die here, with no one to mark the hour?" He stood, brushing his knees with languid thoroughness. I presume the local police are confident? Oh, yes, the vicar said quickly. They're sure it was a fall, though someone said the candlesticks were moved, and the vestry key is still missing, and, well, Whimsy looked at him sharply. You'll forgive me, Reverend, he said, but I believe the dead lady is trying to tell us a most inconvenient truth. The village of Wetherall-on-Stone was the sort of place where the post arrived with ecclesiastical punctuality and secrets decayed slowly, like lace left in sea air. By the time Lord Peter Whimsy had taken tea in the vicarage's conservatory, accompanied by a plate of drearily righteous biscuits and a discussion of chancel roof funding, he had made 3 entirely unrelated observations and stored them all with the affectionate absorption of a collector. Miss Claudia Snaith's death, he had gathered, had produced in the parish a polite note of relief, like the cessation of a noisy sermon. No one said as much, of course. There were pious murmurings about her years of needlework, her firm hand in the Sunday school treasury, her high church disapproval of harvest festivals. But Whimsy, with the antennae of an anthropologist, noted that the condolences were phrased with a delicacy that left space for hope. She had been dedicated, precise, and unmoved by fashion, terms which in ecclesiastical English formed the opposite of praise. It was only when he turned his attentions to the household at Parsonage Close that the true shape of Claudia Snaith's private world began to unroll itself like a badly creased altar cloth. The maid, a nervous girl with curling hair and an expression of constant guilt, was called Elsie. She curtsied to Whimsy with the baffled air of someone who had heard of lords but considered them largely mythical. She was polishing the brass of the umbrella stand when he found her, and nearly dropped the boot scraper when he spoke. "Terribly sorry," said Whimsy, holding up his hands. "Didn't mean to interrupt you in the middle of a sacred rite. May I steal a moment, Miss Elsie? Merely a few questions. No need for nerves. I've already made several frightful social blunders today, and I'm hoping for redemption." Elsie gave a watery smile. "I'm not sure what I can tell you, sir," she said. "Only that Miss Snaith were a proper lady and very particular. Didn't like crumbs or laughter." "Too grave offences," murmured Whimsy. "And was she particular in other ways? Did she have visitors?" "Not often. Only the vicar and his wife, and Mrs. Dantry, what comes with the altar flowers, and Mr. Lugg from the Historical Society, but he only came that once about the old manuscripts." "Manuscripts?" "Yes, sir. Some papers in Latin. She kept them in the vestry safe. Said they were too important to leave in the parish archives." "Quite so," said Whimsy, concealing a flicker of interest behind his habitual air of amused detachment. "Did she ever show them to anyone?" "Not that I know of. Only Mr. Lugg, and he weren't impressed. Said they was forgeries." "Forgers do tend to write with regrettable grammar," Whimsy agreed. "And tell me, on the night before she died, did she say anything unusual?" Elsie's hands twisted in the hem of her apron. "She was quieter than usual, sort of watchful, and she locked up the vestry herself, even though I offered. Said she needed to check the liturgical order of things. But when I went in the next morning to air the place, there she was." Whimsy let the pause hang in the air like incense. "Do you know where she kept the vestry key?" "She always wore it on a little chain, sir. Round her neck, except it wasn't there." "Ah," said Whimsy gently. "Thank you, Miss Elsie. You've been very helpful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." From the parsonage he went on foot toward the church, cutting across the mossy path that ran behind the gardener's cottage. The sun had emerged fitfully from behind a bank of clouds, illuminating the ivy with a guilty gleam. It was here he encountered a stout man in a green jumper, the color of cooked cabbage, methodically pruning a rose bush that had little interest in being pruned. "Mr. Sherman," Whimsy said, removing his hat. "You were the one who found the bonnet." "I were," said the gardener without enthusiasm. "Snagged on the gorse. Thought it were a pheasant's nest at first." Whimsy crouched beside the bush, tracing the flattened path through the grass. "You come this way often?" "Every Tuesday and Friday. I tend the cliff path so the walkers don't trip. Miss Snaith always said the heath was sacred ground." "Very obliging of her. And how long was the bonnet there, would you say?" "Hard to tell. It had been out a bit, damp. Not Miss Snaith's, I gather." Shearman snorted. "Lord, no. She'd never have worn pink. Her sort thinks color's a sin. If you ask me, it looked like something off a theater lady. Lace, ribbons, one of them, costume pieces." Whimsy stood, brushing moss from his knees. "And yet no one in the village admits to losing it." Shearman shrugged. "Not surprised. Folk here don't admit too much. Except Mrs. Dantry. She admits to her husband's gout, but that's about it. Very public-spirited of her." Whimsy left the man to his pruning and proceeded toward the church, this time with a more deliberate eye. He let his gaze drift upward to the bell tower and its newly renovated louvre, down to the iron drain pipe that bore a fresh scar, as if someone had recently made energetic use of it. At the vestry door he paused, studied the lock, then stepped inside. The room was cold, despite the early June sunshine, and smelt faintly of brass polish and lavender. The floor had been cleaned, but a faint dark smear remained in the stone's grain, silent witness to Claudia Snaith's final collapse. On a nearby chair sat a dishevelled altar cloth, half-mended. Whimsy touched it delicately. 12 threads counted between each cross. Painstaking work. Obsessive, even. He turned slowly in place. A crucifix above the desk had been dislodged and replaced crookedly. The candlesticks on the altar were of mismatched height. Most curious of all, the curtains over the vestry window, normally drawn to prevent parishioners seeing the vicar's surplice in disarray, were not the usual sombre grey, but an ill-fitting pair in a garish damask. They hung stiffly, like impostors at a funeral. He drew one aside and peered out. The view gave on to the back of the churchyard, and beyond it, the cliff path. A clever observer, standing here, could have watched for someone coming. He turned and made a brief note in his pocketbook. When he left, it was by the front nave. There he passed the vicar's wife, who had taken up her habitual station amid the hymnals and was vigorously reordering the "Lead Kindly Light" leaflets. "You're investigating, then," she said, in the brittle tone of someone who disapproved of both death and detectives. "Merely indulging in a spot of amateur theology," said Whimsy lightly. "I've always believed the devil is in the detail. Tell me, Mrs. Denholm, did Miss Snaith have any peculiar habits beyond the usual ecclesiastical severity?" She always insisted on locking the altar silver herself. Claimed the curate had butterfingers, and she took to arriving at the vestry far too early, even when no service was scheduled. Said she needed to review the books, but I dare say she liked the quiet. "A woman of reflection, then?" "She brooded," said Mrs. Denholm primly. "She wasn't quite right these past weeks. Kept asking odd things about parish records and whether Mr. Lugg's great-uncle ever kept a diary. I told her if she wanted drama, she should take up novels. She didn't laugh." "No," said Whimsy quietly. "I imagine she wouldn't." As he stepped back into the June light, Lord Peter Whimsy drew in a breath of sea air. Something was not merely amiss, but out of joint, askew in a way he could not yet articulate. A pink bonnet had been found where it had no business to be, and a woman had died alone among liturgical clutter with no one to hear her fall. And still, Whimsy frowned toward the cliffs. There had been, unmistakably, a second presence. Not supernatural, but watched, deliberate, waiting. He adjusted his hat and walked slowly toward Dunningfold. Time, he thought, to ask some rather absurd questions about curtains, candlesticks, and what precisely the Historical Society had been looking for in the safe. The parlour at Dunningfold, though advertised by its hostess as intimate, struck Lord Peter Whimsy as the sort of room where confession was unlikely and furniture impossible. It had been upholstered into submission. Fat brocade chairs, oppressive antimacassars, and a piano so zealously polished it reflected not only the chandeliers but also, by some unhappy trick of light, the scowl of its owner, Mrs. Lavinia Barrett. She greeted Whimsy with a handshake firm enough to audit accounts. "You'll find no scandals here, Lord Peter," she declared. "This house has stood 6 generations and not a single murder." "A rare oversight," murmured Whimsy, "though perhaps you'll yet produce a poison vol au vent." He was rewarded with a startled snort, which might have been laughter or indigestion. She waved him toward a chair which promptly sighed under his weight. "I presume you're here about Claudia," she said, fixing him with eyes that had once terrified a district nurse. "Terrible business. Unnatural woman. How delightfully unambiguous. May I ask what made her unnatural in your view? Too interested in the past, always rummaging in parish documents like a squirrel after theological nuts. Called it history, but I say it's unhealthy. What use is the 17th century when your curtains are rotting?" "Not damask, I trust," Whimsy said lightly, but his mind sharpened as she flinched almost imperceptibly. I had a set once," she said too quickly. "Sold them years ago. Too bright for the drawing room. And where did they go, I wonder? Village Hall, perhaps, or Mrs. Denholm's rummage sale. Why? Oh, only that Miss Snaith was murdered under a pair remarkably similar. Hung in the vestry window, which had never before seen anything more decorative than calico." Mrs. Barrett drew herself up. "Well, I don't know what you're implying, Lord Peter." "Nothing at all. One merely wonders who'd had access to both a vestry window and a rather unfortunate fashion sense." She pursed her lips like a spinster defending a pie crust and offered no further enlightenment. Whimsy left her with thanks and a compliment on her piano, which had not been tuned since the Crimean War, and made his way back to the village lane. He had arranged to meet Mr. Harold Lugg, chairman of the Wetherall Historical Society, and an expert in parchment, heraldry, and, according to rumor, port. The man himself resembled a leather-bound ledger, dry, well-aged, and slightly foxed. He occupied the end parlor of the postmaster's house and looked up from a battered concordance with suspicion when Whimsy entered. "I'm not interested in scandal, my lord," he said crisply. "History is a science, not a melodrama." "I'm glad to hear it," said Whimsy, perching on the arm of a chair with casual precision. "Tell me about the manuscripts you examined for Miss Snaith." Lugg's brows arched. She called them Stuart-era parish records, claimed they proved some connection to recusant families, wanted to seal them in the vestry rather than let them go to the county archive. And were they genuine? Half were copies of burial rolls. Boring, if accurate. The others, well, one was a supposed confession by a curate executed in 1643 for harboring Catholic relics, but it was on modern paper, with ink that hadn't aged a month. An embarrassment. But interesting that she possessed it. Lugg sniffed. "She wouldn't let me take them for proper dating. Said she needed them intact for a reconstruction." I assumed she meant a pageant. These village types get ideas. But it smelt of vanity. She didn't say why she was suddenly obsessed with 17th century clergy. She hinted at something. Some lost item or hidden room. Gothic nonsense. She was an intelligent woman, but far too influenced by novels. Talked of secret panels, blood oaths, saints' bones. I told her, "Madam, if your vestry contains a relic, it's probably someone's forgotten umbrella." Whimsy chuckled. Sound advice. But then she ends up murdered, and her safe unlocked. Lugg looked up sharply. "She mentioned something about the key, said someone had asked for it, but she wouldn't say who. Seemed almost amused. That was last week. Saturday morning, I believe." Whimsy frowned. That would place the conversation 4 days before the death. It did not fit with impulsive crime. It suggested planning, or at least manipulation. And she didn't name them? No, only said she had something they wanted back. Whimsy stood, dusted off imaginary lint. You're quite sure it was Saturday? Positive. I wrote a letter that afternoon, and she returned my copy of Annals of the Deanery. I remember because she'd annotated it in red. Splendid, said Whimsy. Thank you, Mr. Lugg. I shall try to honor your faith in logic. As he stepped out, the scent of overgrown lavender caught at his nose again, and this time something clicked. The church had lavender too, but not in bloom. Sachets, hand-stitched, Claudia's own work. Too many tucked into corners. A neurotic touch or a smokescreen. The air in the vestry had not been pure chance. It had masked something, a chemical. He hurried back through the village square, ignoring the startled stare of the baker's boy, and made straight for the vestry. Inside, he took one of the lavender sachets and turned it in his hand. Then he bent to the floor and ran his fingers along the gap between stones. Just so, there, a faint residue, powdery, grey-white, and slightly granular. He rubbed it between his fingers and sniffed, a sterile, acrid tang. Not plaster, not dust. He pocketed the sachet, then stood again, slowly. Miss Snaith had not simply been tidy. She had been careful. Too careful. A re-examination of the candlesticks revealed a faint smear of wax on the wall sconce, about 6 inches too high to make sense. A hand had reached up, struggled or gestured. Something had occurred not during prayer, but a struggle, and behind the curtain. He lifted the damask fabric once more. Its hem was stitched with coarse black thread, far newer than the curtain itself. Inside the hem, something stiff, a slip of paper, folded tightly. When he opened it, the ink had bled slightly, but the writing was distinct. If he asks again, say nothing. The key is mine. The bonnet is only insurance. No signature. Whimsy replaced the curtain delicately. It was, he reflected, an awfully strange place to leave a threat, unless one expected it never to be found, unless the curtain was not hers to begin with. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, as if to mark the shift in tone. Whimsy stepped into the porch and looked down the lane toward the sea. It was not a bonnet. It was a flag, and someone had raised it, thinking Claudia would yield. But she had not. She had made plans, laid traps, hidden warnings, and someone who feared discovery, had silenced her before she could spring them. Whimsy narrowed his eyes, and someone else, quite recently, had removed the vestry's original curtains. He turned back toward the parsonage, his mind racing. If the threat was meant for Claudia, who had the confidence to deliver it, who needed to manipulate time, conceal a struggle, and shift suspicion, and above all, who had lost a bonnet? Not by accident, by design. The path to the parsonage was less a lane than a worn suggestion of gravel and grass, and Lord Peter Whimsy took it with the same careful unconcern as a man carrying both evidence and conjecture. The scrap of paper concealed behind the hem of the vestry curtain weighed disproportionately in his pocket. Its message was plainly not meant to be read, at least not by anyone honest. Claudia Snaith had hidden it with the precision of someone accustomed to caution, not dramatic, not hurried, something thought through, placed deliberately, like a woman sealing a will she didn't expect to be read for years. The door of the parsonage opened before he knocked. The Reverend Felix Denholm emerged looking slightly wind-blown as if caught mid-sermon or mid-garden, perhaps both. He was a man with the kindly mien of a disappointed sheepdog and the hesitant authority of someone forced to mediate between warring hymn committees. "Lord Peter," he said, "is something the matter?" "I rather think there is, though one never likes to be hasty. Might I trespass again upon your hearth-rug and your hospitality?" Of course," Denholm said, stepping aside. "Though I'm afraid Mrs. Denholm is at the milliner's, and I can't promise anything stronger than cocoa." "I was never a man to scorn a pious beverage," said Whimsy, settling into an armchair with only minor internal protest. "Tell me, Vicar, what did you make of Miss Snaith's interest in church records?" Denholm frowned and folded his hands, the fingers twitching as if they missed the pulpit. "Well, she was certainly thorough. Asked after documents I hadn't seen in years. Wanted to check the vestry safe herself. Seemed convinced there was a sort of, narrative to be uncovered." "Religious in nature?" "No, more genealogical. She spoke of connections between local families. Something about a recusant line, possibly linked to some vanished manor estate. I must confess I didn't follow all the detail. She was meticulous." Whimsy smiled faintly. "I've often found that when people become meticulous, they are usually either cataloguing butterflies or preparing for war. Did she seem afraid?" There was a pause. Denholm looked away. She seemed tight-wound, not fearful precisely, but the sort of person who double-checks the lock, then listens to hear it click. She asked whether anyone else had keys to the vestry. And had they? "Well, yes. Myself, the verger, and until last year, Miss Snaith herself, when she stepped down from her duties." Whimsy leaned forward slightly. "Ah, and that's a wrinkle, isn't it? Because we found the safe was opened, but without signs of force, which suggests someone had access. Or borrowed it." "Borrowed?" Denholm blinked. "You mean someone asked for her key? Or pretended to?" The cocoa arrived, miraculously tepid and faintly ecclesiastical. Whimsy sipped and winced politely. "There's another matter, Reverend," he said. "One that might seem trivial, but you'll forgive me if I seem to dwell on it." "Certainly." "The curtains in the vestry. Where did they come from?" I couldn't say. They've been there at least 6 months, I believe. Claudia installed them herself, I think. She said the old ones had mold." Whimsy stirred his cocoa. "Indeed. And where did she get the replacements?" "I assumed she bought them. Or perhaps someone donated them. The Women's Fellowship have a chest of such things. Or perhaps she found them, or was given them." Denholm looked puzzled. "Does it matter?" "In murder," said Whimsy gently, "everything matters, especially what appears not to. Now, one last thing, this business about a bonnet. I don't suppose it means anything to you." Denholm smiled faintly. "She had a bonnet once. An awful thing, all lace and ribbons. Wore it ironically, I think. Claimed it belonged to her grandmother. She used to wear it to the fete. Caused endless controversy among the committee." "And what became of it?" "Burned, I believe. Last Michaelmas. She made quite a ceremony of it. Said she was done with affectation." Whimsy blinked. "She burned it? Curious. I thought it rather liberating." "Or symbolic," Whimsy murmured, setting his cup down. "Thank you, Vicar. You've been most helpful. I shall now go pay my respects to the custodian of the Women's Fellowship chest. If anyone knows the origin of a pair of Baroque drapes, it will be a lady with opinions and a catalogue." The custodian proved to be Mrs. Fenella Crowell, a widow of ferocious stamina and immaculate lapels, who occupied a trim bungalow with curtains like battlements and a garden in strict military formation. She received Whimsy with brisk enthusiasm. The curtains? Oh yes, they came from Lavinia Barrett. Absolutely determined they weren't proper for her drawing room. Damask, can you believe? I told her, "Lavinia, you can't expect me to put something so red in the Mother's Union cupboard." But Claudia took them, said they might suit the vestry. She knew where they'd come from. "Oh, certainly." She said she'd line them if they were too thin for the window. Had a horror of light-spoiling paper. Always thought that rather admirable. Whimsy nodded slowly. "And Mrs. Barrett, she didn't object." She was relieved, I think, though I heard her grumble later that Claudia had a nose for other people's business. Still, it's not as if Lavinia was short of curtains. "No," said Whimsy, standing, "but she might be short of privacy." He left Mrs. Crowe composing war memoirs over a Victoria sponge and walked a short way before stopping under an ash tree and lighting a cigarette. The pieces were beginning to align. Claudia had installed curtains of another's choosing, ostensibly for preservation, but truly for concealment. Within them, she had sewn a note, not to herself, not for reference, a warning. She had known something was coming. She had expected someone to ask about the key, and she had left behind a signal someone else hadn't found. But who was he? The phrase, "if he asks again," suggested repetition. Someone had already applied pressure, perhaps repeatedly. Could it have been Denholm? No, his transparency was almost suspiciously genuine. Mr. Lugg? Too wrapped up in authenticity to meddle in blackmail. Whimsy thought again of Mrs. Barrett. She had lied or had forgotten about the curtains. More importantly, she had displayed a twitch at the mention of the vestry's drapery. She was strong, domineering, yet exact in her denials. And then there was the curious claim. Claudia had been unnatural. Unnatural. Why? Because she knew something. Because she refused to be silent. And suddenly, Whimsy saw it, the pattern not of opportunity, but motive. The safe had not been opened merely to search. It had been opened to remove something, or to plant something. Either way, someone had needed to obscure the moment of death. Curtain drawn, scent layered, safe ajar. But the question remained, what had Miss Snaith threatened to reveal, and what had she kept, secreted in a curtain, to ensure that someone knew she had seen it coming? Whimsy exhaled smoke in a slow, thoughtful curl. He needed to speak to Lavinia Barrett again, but not directly. She was too defended, too alert, but someone in her house knew more than they had said. Perhaps the maid, perhaps the companion. Quiet Mrs. Hallett, who had stood at the side during their earlier conversation, hands folded like origami. A minor character, ignored in the drawing room. But in a village like Wetherall, it was never the drawing room that told the truth. It was the scullery. The kitchen at Wetherall Court was a long, narrow chamber with low beams, an atmosphere of perpetual steam, and the faint tang of vinegar that clung to the tiles like a disagreeable ghost. Mrs. Hallett was there, naturally, shelling peas with a methodical patience that suggested not duty but penance. The scullery maid, if such a term still applied in this century, had scarpered the moment Whimsy's foot crossed the threshold. He heard her vanish into some rabbit warren of stairs with the furtive speed of someone who had once been scolded for dusting a hall table at the wrong hour and had resolved never to risk independent initiative again. Mrs. Hallett, on the other hand, merely looked up, not surprised, not offended, just still. "I suppose," said Whimsy gently, "that Lady Barrett does not encourage uninvited guests in the kitchen." "She encourages silence, my lord," said Mrs. Hallett without rancour, "which is often more difficult." "And yet," said Whimsy, helping himself to a battered stool and inspecting an elderly blue jug of water with polite interest, "you have managed to navigate her tempers with a degree of fortitude that would impress the psalmist. I wonder if you knew Claudia Snaith well." There was a flicker, so slight it might have been no more than the twitch of a tendon, but Whimsy saw it. "She was my friend," said Mrs. Hallett, "though I wasn't supposed to say so. Her kind don't have friendships, only duties and obligations." "Ah, yes," said Whimsy, "the old binary of servitude. You may be trusted with family silver and the weaning of children, but not with affection." Mrs. Hallett wiped her fingers on her apron and set the bowl aside. "She said things sometimes. About Lavinia. Nothing unkind. Just observations." "Observations are dangerous," said Whimsy, "especially when made by intelligent women. What sort of things?" "She said the house wasn't clean," Mrs. Hallett said at last. "Not dusty, not dirty, but unclean. in the moral sense. She said people pretended too hard in it. A common failing, said Whimsy. What else? She said Lavinia was trying to rewrite something, like she was telling a story and pretending the bits she didn't like had never happened. A family history, perhaps? She never said directly, but she once asked me about a child, years ago, a child Lavinia raised for a while. Said he'd died of diphtheria. Whimsy raised a brow. And didn't he? I wouldn't know, said Mrs. Hallett. It was before my time, but Claudia said there were no records of it. No doctor's note, no burial, no death certificate. He let that settle into the air like rising smoke. Did she say why she was interested? She said secrets rot the bones, and that something in that house stank. Whimsy leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled. And did she speak of it to anyone else? No, said Mrs. Hallett. She said she needed proof before she did anything. She thought Lavinia might suspect. Asked me to watch if anyone went into the vestry at odd hours. Said if anything happened to her, the truth was in the curtain. I didn't understand her then. But you do now. I think I do. Whimsy stood. Thank you. And one final thing. The bonnet. Mrs. Hallett looked at him. She told Lavinia it had belonged to her grandmother, but it didn't. She found it in a trunk upstairs. One of Lavinia's. Said it had a name stitched into it. Marjorie. With a date. 1913. Indeed, murmured Whimsy. A trunk not opened in decades, and yet the bonnet was recognizable. Lavinia didn't like the reminder. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. Whimsy inclined his head and stepped back into the corridor, leaving Mrs. Hallett with her bowl and her silence. By the time he reached the front hall, Lavinia Barrett was descending the staircase, composed as ever, wearing a steel-grey dress that would have suited a bishop's funeral, and an expression that had never once said please or thank you. She paused at the sight of him, a hand lightly upon the banister. You seem to have made yourself quite at home, Lord Peter. I do try, said Whimsy. Your scullery is most inviting. I had a thought about Claudia's bonnet. Do you recall it? Her nostrils flared, almost imperceptibly. A hideous thing, she wore it to be provocative. Yes, said Whimsy. So I gathered. But you told me she burned it. That seems decisive. It was symbolic, Lavinia said flatly. She said she was tired of masquerade. Rather ironic, given the bonnet was never hers, said Whimsy, letting his tone cool by a few degrees. She found it in your trunk, did she not? There was a fractional pause, and then the smallest lift of one eyebrow. She said many things, most of them absurd. Curious, though, said Whimsy, that she might find a child's bonnet embroidered with the name Marjorie and a date barely a year before the supposed diphtheria incident. Even more curious that she should hide a note in the vestry, mentioning someone asking questions about a safe. I'm sure you have some theory, Lavinia said with glacial detachment. You do seem the type. Oh, several. I collect them. One is about a child who didn't die, but disappeared. Perhaps spirited away, adopted unofficially, hidden to spare scandal, a child who might still be alive if one cared to dig deeply enough. Another theory is about Claudia Snaith discovering that lie and threatening to expose it. Really, Lord Peter, she said, turning away. Do try to keep your stories tidy. I do, he said softly. But you see, the past rarely does. It frays at the edges. Like a bonnet that should have been burned, but wasn't. Like a woman who should have kept her silence, but didn't. He stepped out into the evening, where the wind had begun to rattle the hedgerows with renewed mischief. He walked past the church again, pausing to glance once more at the vestry window. The curtain hung there, ordinary now, like an old player waiting in the wings, knowing the cue was almost due. He felt it, the tension, the taut silence before a conclusion. Something had been taken from Claudia's safe. Something damning. Someone had gone into the vestry before the police. Someone who knew what to look for, But Claudia had not relied only on her hiding place. She had spoken to Mrs. Hallett. She had worn the bonnet in public. She had sewn her message into a lining. Not the actions of a woman frightened into silence, the actions of a woman prepared for war. And then, like the whisper of a dropped stitch, something fell into place. The safe, the documents, the lack of force. Only 3 people had the key, Denholm had said. But Whimsy had seen the lock himself. It wasn't a complex mechanism. It was, he had thought at the time, almost insultingly simple, unless it had been changed. A new key, or a new owner, someone who hadn't returned their key when they stepped down from their duties. Someone who had never admitted keeping it. Claudia, or someone pretending to be her. He turned abruptly and began to walk. No longer toward the vicarage or Wetherall Court, but the small cottage past the green, where a Mr. Lugg still purported to write ghost stories and walk his dog at improbable hours. Because it occurred to Lord Peter Whimsy, all at once and with dreadful precision, that he had never actually seen the man grieve. And because men who pretend to see ghosts often have more to hide than the ghosts themselves. Whimsy found Lugg's cottage exactly where the village gossip had indicated, tucked like a half-swallowed apology behind a screen of dishevelled laurel and flaking iron gates. The garden was overgrown with weeds attempting topiary, while the path wore a patchwork of forgotten attempts at gravel. The windows, small, squinting things, were shuttered from within, though a plume of smoke from the chimney suggested life persisted indoors, if only on simmer. Whimsy paused at the threshold, adjusted his cufflinks with an air of one preparing for amateur theatricals, and rapped twice on the door. It opened, not immediately, but with the careful reluctance of a man who believes strongly in locked doors, even in daylight. Mr. Lugg's face appeared, pale and pinched in the frame, his shirt half unbuttoned and his hair in unrepentant disarray. "Lord Whimsy," he said, with the precise intonation of someone who had hoped never to pronounce those words. "I fear I may be intruding upon your creative process," said Whimsy cheerfully, "unless, of course, you do your best ghost-writing at 6:30, sans tie and with the curtains drawn." Lugg hesitated, then opened the door wider. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "Few people do," said Whimsy, stepping inside. "That, I think, is the charm of murder investigations. So very impromptu. Rather like chamber music, but with daggers." The sitting room was sparsely decorated and smelled faintly of damp paper and pipe ash. A large, battered typewriter presided over one table like a reluctant idol, while beside it a bottle of whiskey leaned companionably against a stack of drafts. "I came," said Whimsy, "to discuss the late Claudia Snaith and her secrets." "I told the police what I knew," said Lugg flatly. "Indeed," said Whimsy. "You said she was tired, despondent, even spoke of leaving." "She was frightened," Lugg said, voice tighter now. "Not of death, necessarily, but of being watched. She thought the house had begun to turn on her." "A peculiar statement," said Whimsy, lowering himself into a chair that groaned under his frame. "Do you believe in haunted houses, Mr. Lugg?" "No, but I believe in haunted people." Whimsy regarded him thoughtfully. "And do you believe she confided in you because she had no one else, or because you had more to gain than most?" Lugg stiffened. "If you're accusing me of something—" "Not accusing," said Whimsy smoothly. "Merely proposing. You see, the safe was opened without force, the contents removed neatly. But Claudia, as we now know, suspected she might be silenced, and left word of her concerns in several places. One of them, Mr. Lugg, was with you." He paused, studying the man's face. "She told you about the bonnet, didn't she?" Lugg's hands clenched against the arms of his chair. "She told me many things, but she wasn't always rational." "Ah," said Whimsy, "and yet her irrationalities seem to correspond with a rather precise understanding of the family skeletons, the lost child, the inconsistencies in Lady Lavinia's history, even that tiresome safe, which you must admit was rather beyond the reach of your average domestic maid. She said there were papers, Lugg said finally, voice dropping. Something about an adoption that never was, a falsified name. She didn't show me, just said it proved Lavinia had hidden a girl somewhere, that it was all connected to that bonnet. And Marjorie. Whimsy said nothing for a moment. The wind whistled faintly through a chimney. She asked me to keep a copy of her will, Lugg added, almost too quietly. She said if anything happened, if she slipped or tripped or took a fall, someone should know that she didn't intend to go. And the will, said Whimsy. Gone, said Lugg, shaking his head. I went to the drawer where she told me she'd hidden it. It was empty, no sign of forced entry. No, said Whimsy. There wouldn't be, because whoever removed it had a key, possibly more than one. Lugg looked up sharply. You mean Lavinia? I mean, said Whimsy, rising slowly, that I need to see the church records. Church, specifically the vestry logbook and the baptism and death records from 1913, the year of the bonnet, the year, one might say, that Marjorie ceased to exist. He turned at the door. If Claudia was right, then someone erased not just a child's name, but replaced it with another's. The walk to the church was short, the path lit now by a pale, uncompromising moon. The vestry was still, its door unlocked, the crime scene tape having long since been rendered symbolic. Within, the air held that cold breath of stone places. Whimsy moved carefully, brushing dust from the oak cabinet where registers were kept. The books were stacked neatly, too neatly. He drew out the ledger for 1913. Inside, the hand was a sharp, angular script. Reverend Alton, predecessor to Denholm, if memory served. Baptisms listed in tidy succession. Deaths on the opposite page. He scanned. Marjorie. There. Marjorie Lillian Barrett. Born March 1913. Died October, same year. Cause, diphtheria. But there was a problem. The same child, Marjorie Lillian Barrett, appeared again in the baptism register for 1914. Same parents, same sponsors, same vicar's hand. Impossible. He turned the pages. Rapidly now. In 1914, no death recorded. In fact, no Marjorie at all. He turned back to 1913. The death record was in a different ink, slightly off color. He looked closer. Under the lamplight, the truth emerged. The death entry had been inserted clumsily. A later edition, forged to align with a name already removed from somewhere else. So the child had not died, at least not then. But she had ceased to exist legally in one way or another, and Claudia had found this, or had suspected enough to check. Whimsy rose and closed the book. His fingers brushed the altar rail absently. There were still questions. Who was the child? Where had she gone? And why hide her? But now he knew one thing with certainty. Claudia Snaith had not died by mischance. She had threatened the fragile edifice of Lavinia Barrett's carefully structured world, and for that she had been silenced. Neatly, quietly, respectably. Only the bonnet had remained, a thread too inconvenient to snip. And somewhere, Whimsy thought grimly, someone else still lived who remembered Marjorie. He would find them, and when he did, the mask would fall. But first, he needed to visit a solicitor. Because if Claudia had written a new will, and it had vanished, then someone had profited in her absence. And the law, unlike people, kept better records of such things. The solicitor in question was one Mr. Edward Glimpton of Glimpton and Brisk, a firm whose continued operation was one of the more enduring mysteries of the county, being maintained chiefly, it seemed, by the obdurate refusal of its founders to admit that time had passed them by. Their office, ensconced in the corner of the high street like an old spinster aunt in an ancestral wing chair, smelled faintly of damp vellum and moral rectitude. Whimsy, ushered in by a clerk so unobtrusive he might have been furniture with opinions, found Glimpton himself seated at a desk festooned with pigeonholes and trembling with paper. "Lord Peter Whimsy," the solicitor said without enthusiasm, adjusting pince-nez that had never entirely reconciled themselves to his nose. "I do hope this is not in reference to some litigious matter involving the late Miss Snaith. The estate has not yet been settled." "Nor, I fear, is the question of her demise," said Whimsy, crossing one elegantly trousered knee over the other. "I come, rather, in the spirit of inquiry. You see, Mr. Glimpton, I'm a great admirer of the minor peculiarities of record-keeping, the way things vanish, reappear, or leave fingerprints upon the air, as it were." Glimpton's expression did not soften. "Miss Snaith engaged us for routine matters, wills, property, conveyance of minor trusts, nothing extraordinary." Said Whimsy. "Extraordinary is always such a flexible term. Tell me, did she ever alter her will?" The solicitor raised an eyebrow. "If she did so, Lord Peter, the document would, of course, be confidential until probate. Though I may say—" He hesitated, then continued with something close to a cough. "A recent revision was indeed undertaken. A fortnight ago, it was never deposited with us in final form." "Interesting," murmured Whimsy. "I assume she took the draft to review." "She did. Said she wished to make certain adjustments before executing it. We expected its return within the week." "And in this revised version, did she mention Miss Lavinia Barrett?" "Miss Barrett was not named." "Nor was she in the previous version." "She was," said Glimpton, now regarding Whimsy with more wary sharpness. "A beneficiary of considerable proportion. Claudia Snaith's prior will, dated 2 years ago, left a portion of her estate to Miss Barrett's art fund." "And in the revised version?" Glimpton said nothing. "Well," said Whimsy, rising, "I do hope it reappears. A rather tiresome business otherwise. One would hate to think someone had mislaid the document in the interest of tidy legacies." He left Glimpton to his worry and returned to the village under a sky now thickening with the premonition of rain. A quiet urgency was beginning to gather around the edges of the case, a feeling that the facade, so carefully mortared with years of silence, was beginning to crack. Whimsy, as ever, felt no rush. Truth, he believed, preferred to emerge not under pressure, but through elegant coaxing, like a reluctant cat from beneath a sofa. Back at the rectory, he found Bunter polishing the silver, a therapeutic act in Bunter's case, akin to prayer. "My lord," said Bunter, glancing up, "Mrs. Haynes called this afternoon. She left a message. Said she found something you might wish to see. Something in the attic." "Did she now?" Whimsy peeled off his gloves. "I'm beginning to wonder if all English attics are fitted with ghostly archives by default. It's where we keep the history we wish we hadn't had." He paused. "Did she sound alarmed?" "Troubled, I would say, my lord. Perhaps uncertain whether she discovered something or imagined it." Whimsy nodded. "Let us hope for the former. We are dreadfully short of reliable artifacts." He walked to the Haynes cottage under a rising wind. The village, at that hour, had drawn itself inward. Chimneys puffed apologetically, and curtains glowed with the domestic peace of those who preferred tea and radio to scandal. Mrs. Haynes met him at the door with a face drawn into uncertain folds. "It's in the trunk," she said without greeting, leading him up narrow stairs that creaked like old consciences. "I never thought— I don't know how it came to be there." The attic was cramped and smelled of camphor and thyme. A single bulb swung above, casting uncertain shadows. In the far corner, beneath a dusty coverlet, lay an old cedar trunk. Mrs. Haynes opened it with a breath that shivered. "It was tucked under the lining," she said. "I'd never noticed before." She drew out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a child's frock, faded and delicately embroidered, and beside it, a photograph. Whimsy held it to the light. 2 women and a child. The women were unmistakable. Lavinia Barrett, decades younger, her beauty sharp and unsmiling, and beside her, a nursemaid, expression caught between duty and pride. The child, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, wore the same frock now in Whimsy's hands. But there was something odd. The photograph was dated on the back, July 1915, which meant the child could not be Marjorie Barrett, dead, according to the records, in 1913. And yet, "Do you recognize the nurse?" Whimsy asked softly. Mrs. Haynes nodded slowly. "That's my aunt," she said. "She worked for the Barretts a long time ago, left suddenly. My mum said there was a scandal, something about a child being sent away." Whimsy's mind ticked like a clock unwinding. "Do you know where she went?" "She died years back," said Mrs. Haynes, "but I remember her talking, once, about a girl named Margaret, or maybe Margot, said she was clever, had a birthmark like a teardrop behind her ear." Whimsy froze. Claudia Snaith, he remembered, had worn her hair up for a party 2 summers ago. A curious thing had caught his eye then, a pale, oval-shaped mark behind the left ear. He had thought it a scar and never asked. Now it clicked into place with a terrifying neatness. Claudia had not only discovered the truth, she had been the truth. She was the child who had been erased, renamed, reinvented. She was Marjorie. And someone close, had realized she remembered. It was no longer about inheritance or gossip. It was about erasure, about survival. And the question now, Whimsy thought grimly, was no longer why she had died. It was who had first decided she must never have been born. Whimsy descended the narrow attic steps as though retreating from some fragile place in time, his mind stitching together the implications with unnerving rapidity. Behind him, Mrs. Haynes lingered at the trunk, fingers resting on the edge as if uncertain whether she ought to close it again or leave it ajar, for memory or judgment. The smell of mothballs and cedar clung to Whimsy's coat as he stepped into the chill evening. Outside, the village had hunkered down into its nighttime hush. No sound but the occasional fretful bark of a dog, the crunch of his own footsteps on gravel, and the faint ticking of what his friend Parker might call the moral clockwork. Whimsy, as ever, preferred less categorical mechanisms, though he appreciated that someone somewhere must be keeping tally. He paused beneath the gas lamp by the green, adjusting his hat. Somewhere in that well-behaved hamlet, there was a person who had known Marjorie Barrett had not died in 1913 and had spent a good many years making sure no one else found out, or rather, almost no one. Claudia Snaith, Marjorie herself, reborn in discretion and legal fiction, had evidently rediscovered her identity. But how? A whisper of memory? A name overheard? A letter long, hidden and suddenly unearthed? She had clearly begun probing, revising her will, perhaps even confronting someone. That last was fatal. The next morning, Whimsy broke his fast with solemn efficiency and rode into the village with the briskness of a man pursuing a phrase at the tip of his tongue. He had arranged to speak again with Miss Lavinia Barrett, and her note, written in her usual copper plate, had arrived with studied composure. "Of course. At your convenience." She received him in the same drawing-room, now suspiciously tidy. The tattered shawl that had so offended his aesthetic sense earlier was gone, replaced with a stiff linen cover. The mirror had been cleaned. She had, one sensed, performed a kind of moral laundering. "Lord Peter," she said with a tight smile, "do forgive the state of things yesterday. My nerves, well, you understand." "Indeed," said Whimsy, sitting. Death can be most disagreeable in its logistics. One never knows whether to call the coroner or the laundry first. She gave a small, brittle laugh. "Quite." Whimsy let the silence develop like a photograph. "I've been tracing Claudia's family history," he said. A fascinating tale. Quite an archive, as it happens. One learns so much from village trunks. Things best forgotten, or else never understood. Lavinia folded her hands. You must find all this dreadfully romantic, Lord Peter. Secret heirs, hidden wills, tragic deaths. Oh, I abhor romance, said Whimsy mildly. Give me a good unpaid gas bill and I can construct an entire Shakespearean tragedy. Still, there is something peculiarly compelling in the question of identity, particularly when it proves, shall we say, retroactive. She hesitated, fractionally, and that hesitation, to Whimsy's trained ear, was as clear as a bell. I wonder, he said, how one would feel, having disposed of a child, only to find her across a luncheon table years later, criticizing the fish. Her voice was sharp, like a drawer slammed too fast. I don't know what you mean. No? Whimsy's eyes were lidded. Let me suggest something. He leaned forward. Your sister, Celia Barrett, later Snaith, bore a child in 1912. The father, though never named publicly, was likely someone inconvenient, socially or legally. The child was given a name, Marjorie, and entered into record. Lavinia's lips were bloodless now, pressed into a line that would have made any governess proud. Then, Whimsy continued, the child was sent away. Whether through shame or fear, or simply because Miss Celia wished to resume her life without appendages, I cannot say, but sent away she was. Perhaps to a convent, or to be adopted under a different name. He allowed the pause to settle. Now, suppose the child survived, was never told. Suppose she grew into a young woman named Claudia, modest, reserved, excellent at accounts. Suppose she applied for a position with Miss Lavinia Barrett in, say, 1930. Lavinia's voice was brittle. You suggest I recognized her. No, said Whimsy, I suggest you didn't. Not then. How could you? A child grows, faces alter, but perhaps something later tipped the scale. A photograph, a letter, some turn of phrase that echoed your sister. And perhaps Miss Claudia began remembering too, or investigating. He stood. You see, Miss Barrett, the tragedy of disposing of a child is that you never know when she'll come home again. He left her then, rather abruptly, and returned to the rectory where Bunter, having anticipated him in the unspoken way only Bunter could, had already laid out the files he had requested. Photographic reproduction of the village birth registers, my lord, said Bunter, tapping the pages with reverence, and the relevant coroner's notice from 1913. Excellent, said Whimsy, drawing them toward him. The birth was there, clear as day. Marjorie Elaine Barrett, born to Celia Miriam Barrett, March 1912. And the death certificate? Curious. The child had been declared dead after a sudden illness. Fever and respiratory failure. Signed by Dr. Elbridge, now long deceased. But something about the entry was wrong. Bunter, said Whimsy slowly, why is this death certificate in blue ink when all the others that year are in black? Poor quality reproduction, Bunter suggested. Or a late insertion. Whimsy fetched a magnifier and held it to the page. The hand isn't the same. Look. Note the way the E in Elaine loops downward, and the ink bleeds differently. This was added, later, possibly even forged. Bunter said nothing. He simply passed Whimsy a second item, a clipping, from a hospital register in Surrey, 1915. Margaret Elaine Snaith, Whimsy read aloud. Admitted with scarlet fever. Recovered. Discharged to the care of Miss H. Temple, matron of St. Hester's Girls' Home. He lowered the page. So, she didn't die. She was renamed. And someone had forged a certificate to suggest otherwise. Why? To sever the tie? To silence the past? Later that afternoon, he found Inspector Peacock walking along the green and fell in beside him. The policeman, though gruff and mildly suspicious of Whimsy's brand of detection, had grown increasingly aware that his own case notes now resembled a series of red herrings holding hands. "You've been quiet," said Peacock, "but I've no doubt you've been turning the place upside down in your head." "Gently rummaging," Whimsy replied. "I have a suggestion, dear man. You'll want to search Miss Barrett's desk, look for a copy of Claudia Snaith's revised will, and possibly some old letters. If she knew, if she ever admitted it in writing, it would be there." Peacock scowled. "You think Lavinia Barrett killed her?" "I think," said Whimsy, "that Lavinia Barrett was raised to believe some people were better, erased than acknowledged. Whether she acted herself or instructed another is a detail, but Miss Snaith's death was no accident. It was the closing of a ledger." They parted, and Whimsy walked on alone, the wind lifting the collar of his coat. He did not yet have proof. But the shape of the truth had formed in his mind, fine as porcelain and just as breakable. There were still gaps, but one by one the lies were thinning. And somewhere in the village, someone was beginning to sense that Lord Peter Whimsy was not in fact going away. The next morning's post arrived with the faint rustle of precision. Bunter brought it in on a small salver, as though announcing a papal decree. Whimsy, seated at the vicar's borrowed escritoire and staring thoughtfully at the bindings of a faded county almanac, took it without comment. His fingers, long and pale, flicked through envelopes without interest until they arrested on a hand addressed in a spidery, angular hand that might have belonged to a dedicated music teacher or a retired bishop's widow. "Miss Temple," he murmured, tearing the envelope open with the blunt ivory paper knife Bunter had thoughtfully laid out. The letter within was brief, formal, and ultimately vindicating. Miss H. Temple, now 93 and living in supervised comfort in Tunbridge Wells, confirmed that in 1915 she had accepted into her care a child named Margaret Elaine Snaith, whose background had been unusually delicate and the subject of some whispered concern among the board. She recalled the girl as obedient, intelligent, and sensitive to a degree suggestive of hidden distress. There had been no further correspondence from family. The name Barrett did not arise, but Miss Temple did remember one particular incident. A letter the child once tried to post, marked "To my mummy," intercepted and destroyed by the house mistress on grounds of impropriety. The child had cried for days. Whimsy folded the letter and stared out of the window at the church tower, where jackdaws clattered around the bell. There it was, then. The silence imposed early, and someone had benefited, materially or emotionally, from maintaining it. He was still contemplating the implications when the vicar, Reverend Cattermole, entered with a hesitant knock. The clergyman had the curious expression of a man who had overheard something regrettable and was wondering how much longer he could morally ignore it. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, "but one of the women from the Mothers' Guild has told me something you may wish to hear. A trifle, but odd." "My dear Cattermole," said Whimsy, rising, "in my experience, the entire universe is composed of odd trifles stacked in nervous formation." The vicar seated himself and folded his hands like a man preparing to conduct a funeral. "She claims," he said, "that on the day Miss Snaith died, she saw Mr. Gilbert, the solicitor, standing just outside the cottage. It was before the doctor arrived. He was not knocking nor ringing. He stood there, she said, for some time, just watching the door." Whimsy's eyebrows rose faintly. "And yet Mr. Gilbert told the inspector he had not been in the village that day." "Precisely." Whimsy smiled thinly. "An error in recollection or a lie of convenience? I fear I cannot say." "You've said enough, Cattermole." "Thank you." He left the rectory not 5 minutes later, a new sharpness to his gait. The village solicitor, Mr. Thomas Gilbert, had always struck Whimsy as unpleasantly urbane, like a man whose cologne had been selected specifically to mislead creditors. That he should appear on Miss Snaith's doorstep hours before her body was discovered, and fail to mention it, was more than inconsistency. It was strategy. Whimsy found him in his office, a converted Georgian parlour papered in sage green, with a brass-topped gas fire and an air of genteel concealment. Mr. Gilbert received him stiffly, waving away the suggestion of tea and sitting opposite with the aspect of a man who had grown used to being the cleverest in any room, and was now quietly unsure. "To what do I owe the honour, Lord Peter?" Whimsy removed his gloves delicately and laid them beside him. "A few questions, Mr. Gilbert. You stated to Inspector Peacock that you were not in the village on the morning of Miss Snaith's death. That is correct." "Unfortunately," said Whimsy, "Mrs. Clitheroe from the Mothers' Guild seems to disagree. She placed you on the lane near Claudia's cottage at precisely 10:30 that morning." "You were," she observed, staring at the door with remarkable intensity. Gilbert blinked. Well, that's quite a mistake." "I doubt Mrs. Clitheroe would mistake you for the postman," said Whimsy gently, "even if you do share a certain rural melancholy." Gilbert flushed. "I may have passed by the cottage." Paused, I believe. A silence. "I had received a note," Gilbert said at last, his voice tight, "from Miss Snaith, requesting a private meeting to discuss changes to her will." "Indeed?" said Whimsy. "And did she indicate the nature of those changes?" "She did not," Gilbert admitted, "only that they were urgent and should not be delayed. I arrived. I hesitated. I was not expected for another hour and did not wish to appear over-eager. I took a brief walk and returned later. When I knocked, there was no answer. I assumed she had stepped out. I left." "You did not inform the police?" "There seemed no reason. Until now." Gilbert's expression hardened. "Am I to be accused of something, Lord Peter? Of error, perhaps. Not yet of sin." He stood. "Though it does strike me as odd," Whimsy mused aloud, "that Miss Snaith should wish to revise her will so suddenly, after decades of stability, especially after visiting Miss Barrett the day before." Gilbert said, "Nothing. Did she name a new heir, do you think, or rescind an old one?" "Miss Snaith's legal affairs are confidential." "Naturally," said Whimsy, already moving toward the door, "though one might imagine they are considerably less confidential now she is dead." That afternoon, Inspector Peacock returned from a search of Lavinia Barrett's home with several items of interest: a torn letter stuffed into a sewing box beneath layers of muslin, and a small, dusty envelope containing a faded photograph of a girl not older than 8, her eyes wide, mouth smiling uncertainly beneath a large bonnet. The letter was only half there. Its counterpart had been torn away. But enough remained. "Cannot continue this way. If you will not acknowledge the truth, mother or aunt, it is yours to say, but I must have the answer, Lavinia. I have already written to Mr. Gilbert." Peacock laid it down. "Dated the day before she died." Whimsy stared at the girl in the photograph. The bonnet was outsized, clearly not hers. A dressing-up game, perhaps, or a theatrical costume. And yet, the bonnet was never hers, Whimsy said softly. Peacock frowned. "Beg pardon?" But Whimsy didn't answer. He was already lost in the implications. A costume, a misidentification, a record faked with blue ink. And beneath it all, a woman quietly trying to claim her name. He turned back to the inspector. "Time to speak with Miss Barrett again, but I'd like to try a little experiment first." That night, long past the village's bedtime, Whimsy returned to the lane by Claudia Snaith's cottage. Bunter waited with a lantern. Together, they moved quietly through the rooms, past the neat armchair and the empty hearth, to the hallway where the clock had long since ceased to tick. Whimsy stood for a long time in the doorway, gazing up at the stairs. The doctor said she had fallen, hit her head, but there was no bruising on the arms or legs, no sign of a struggle. He moved to the kitchen. Tea left untouched, letter on the bureau, no coat missing. He pointed to the latch. And yet, this was unlatched, though she always kept it locked. The doctor mentioned it. Bunter said nothing. She expected someone, trusted them, or believed they had a right to enter. He turned slowly to face the empty room. And that someone took everything from her. Again. He looked at Bunter and smiled faintly, though the expression was far from mirth. "We're nearly there, Bunter." "Very good, my lord." Whimsy walked to the window, where the faintest moonlight glimmered on the glass. "Let's see if Miss Barrett enjoys a bit of theatre." And the next day, the play would begin. The morning broke grey and heavy, the sort of weather that seems to weigh the air down with secrets, as if the heavens themselves conspire to keep their counsel. Lord Peter Whimsy arrived at Lavinia Barrett's house under cover of this dim light, accompanied by Bunter, who carried an assortment of discreetly folded papers and a modest leather case whose contents would soon become relevant. Miss Barrett was already in the parlour when they were shown in. Sitting primly, a faint flush betraying some mixture of nervous anticipation and feigned composure. Her eyes, sharp and dark, flicked briefly to Whimsy and then away, as though calculating whether to betray or defend herself. "Good morning, Miss Barrett," Whimsy began with the lightest of bows, as if greeting a reluctant debutante. "I trust you slept well?" She gave a thin smile. "As well as can be expected. I should imagine the events of the past week have made repose something of a stranger." Her fingers twisted the lace of her handkerchief. "Indeed." Whimsy seated himself deliberately opposite her. "Miss Barrett, I find it necessary to be frank, although I appreciate such candor is rarely reciprocated. The evidence thus far is patchy at best, but it compels me toward a particular conclusion, one I hope you will help clarify." She raised an eyebrow. "Please do enlighten me." "I propose a demonstration," he said, unfolding a carefully drawn plan of the village lane and surrounding cottages, the scale precise to the inch. "You are, of course, familiar with the layout of the cottages and the approximate distances between them." "Entirely." "Excellent. You will find, then, that the lane from your home to Claudia Snaith's cottage is but a few hundred yards in length, and that the walk should take a brisk man no more than 4 minutes. "Yes," said Miss Barrett, voice steady. "Now, on the morning Miss Snaith died, you have told Inspector Peacock that you were out of the village at the time, called away by urgent business." She inclined her head slightly. "That is correct." "Yet Mrs. Clitheroe, among others, reports seeing you in the lane that very morning, shortly before the body was found." Miss Barrett's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Whimsy produced a slender silver pocket watch, its face gleaming dully in the parlour's dimness. "Allow me to suggest the following. If you will accompany me on a brief walk along the lane, we can reconstruct the times of relevant sightings and perhaps clarify the chronology. I would ask you to move at a normal pace, that we might compare our observations." The lady regarded him with a flicker of something almost amused, then nodded. "Very well." The 2 men and Miss Barrett stepped outside, the damp earth cool beneath their feet. Whimsy glanced at his watch and began a slow, deliberate pace toward the Snaith cottage, Miss Barrett following just behind. "Observe," Whimsy said, "that the lane is quiet, save for the occasional chirp of birds and the distant clang of a smithy's hammer. No other souls pass us, which accords with Mrs. Clitheroe's testimony of a solitary figure in the lane." They reached the doorway of the now silent cottage. Whimsy paused, then turned to Miss Barrett. "You see, it is plausible to be here at 10:30, as Mrs. Clitheroe stated, and yet to leave swiftly to attend to urgent business, as you claim. 4 minutes hence, you might have been elsewhere." "I see the point," she said somewhat grudgingly. "Indeed. But it does require your movements to be precise, and your explanations truthful." She made no reply. Back inside, Whimsy allowed Bunter to pour tea, and the conversation turned to the torn letter discovered by Inspector Peacock. Whimsy unfolded the half-sheet and held it between them. "The missing portion," he said, "must contain the key to the motive. The writer begs for an acknowledgement of the truth, suggests some confusion or concealment regarding maternity, and hints at a desperate need for clarity. Miss Barrett's face paled. "Are you aware of what truth the letter refers to?" Whimsy asked gently. She bit her lip. "It is family matters, quite personal. I had no wish to bring scandal." Whimsy inclined his head, masking a growing understanding. "It appears, Miss Barrett, that there is a question of identity and perhaps of inheritance, too." She swallowed and met his gaze steadily. Margaret Elaine Snaith was not always Margaret Elaine Snaith. The room seemed to shrink around them as the truth pressed in. Miss Barrett, with a sigh, confessed that the child known as Claudia Snaith was in fact her half-sister by blood, a secret fiercely protected by their mother and the family solicitor, Mr. Gilbert. She was placed with Miss Temple under an assumed name to protect the family's reputation, Miss Barrett admitted. It was a measure taken to conceal complications. "Complications that have come back to trouble us all," Whimsy said softly. The conversation turned to Mr. Gilbert once more. Whimsy's suspicions had deepened. The solicitor's visits, his concealed knowledge, and his role in the will's revisions suggested a man deeply entangled in the family's web of secrets, and perhaps culpable. "I shall pay Mr. Gilbert another visit," Whimsy said. "It seems he has more to reveal." The afternoon sun had pierced through the clouds, casting long shadows across the village as Whimsy and Bunter approached the solicitor's office once more. This time the air was thicker with tension. Gilbert greeted them with a wary glance, but invited them in. "Mr. Gilbert," Whimsy began, "your discretion is noted, but your silence is less so. The new will, amended just days before Miss Snaith's death, named a new beneficiary, one previously unmentioned." Gilbert's jaw tightened. "Legal matters are confidential. Yet you chose to withhold your presence on the morning of the death from Inspector Peacock," Whimsy said evenly. "And you were seen lurking near the cottage. Explain this." Gilbert faltered. "I came to warn Miss Snaith," he said, finally. "She was in danger. Someone was threatening to expose the family's secrets, which would ruin us all." "Who, Mr. Gilbert, and why? If you feared exposure, your silence is more damaging than the truth." Gilbert looked away. "I did what I thought best." Whimsy leaned forward. "Mr. Gilbert, the lady is dead, and the secrets have already begun to unravel. It is time for candor." Gilbert, defeated, revealed that he had learned of Lavinia Barrett's movements and had tried to prevent a confrontation between the sisters, fearing that Lavinia might attempt to claim what she believed was her rightful inheritance. "But did you kill Miss Snaith?" Whimsy asked quietly. "No," Gilbert's voice cracked. "I swear it." Outside, Bunter awaited, and Whimsy's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place. The torn letter, the altered will, the secret identity, and now the escalating tension between the sisters. Returning to Lavinia Barrett's home that evening, Whimsy proposed a final meeting with all involved parties. The vicar, Inspector Peacock, and the two sisters gathered in the dimly lit parlor, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Whimsy took his place at the head of the room. "Let us reconstruct the events of that fateful morning," he began. "Miss Snaith's fall was no accident. It was the culmination of years of secrets, lies, and fears." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Someone sought to silence her, to prevent the truth from emerging. That person orchestrated a deception, staging the fall, hiding evidence, manipulating time and witness. He fixed his gaze on Lavinia Barrett. "You were seen in the lane, yet claim absence. You harbored resentment and a claim. You confronted your sister, and yet it was not you who dealt the fatal blow." Surprise flickered in Lavinia's eyes. "Mr. Gilbert, you confessed to visits and warnings, but your concern was less for the sisters than for the family's name. You stood outside the cottage, hoping to intervene, but not to kill." Gilbert's face drained of color. "The true culprit is someone less obvious. a figure moving between loyalties who sought to protect some interest by darker means. He turned to the vicar. "Reverend Cattermole, you mentioned something you withheld. The missing salver from the Snaith cottage, found later in the vicarage kitchen." The vicar swallowed. "A mistake. It was brought in by accident with some dishes." Whimsy shook his head. "No, it was taken deliberately, by someone who wished to create a false trail." The room grew silent. "Miss Barrett, when did you last see your cousin, Henry Clitheroe?" She hesitated. "Henry? Yes. The heir presumptive, with a known history of gambling and debts. He was desperate for money, and had motive aplenty." From behind the door came a faint creak, and Inspector Peacock stepped forward. "Lord Peter, Henry Clitheroe was found last night at the village inn. Apparently he left in a hurry after a heated argument with Miss Barrett." The atmosphere thickened. "Miss Barrett, was the bonnet yours, or hers?" Whimsy asked quietly, holding the faded photograph. She looked down. The bonnet was hers, a childish token from our past, taken from me when I was little, kept as a secret. Whimsy's lips twitched. Such trifles often betray the weightiest truths. He glanced around, eyes sharp. The murderer hoped to cast suspicion on the wrong person, but the pieces cannot lie. They never do. The night's shadows gathered, and the mystery's web tightened as the final act approached. The game was nearly at an end, and Lord Peter Whimsy's keen intellect prepared to strike. Under the dim glow of the parlour's flickering firelight, Lord Peter Whimsy settled into his accustomed posture, the very picture of composed gravity, save for the faintest trace of that half-smile which bespoke an amused superiority. The assembled company, tense and watchful, awaited the culmination of the tangled thread that had wound itself through their lives these past days. "I trust you will forgive the theatricality of this setting," Whimsy began, voice measured and deliberate, "but such matters as we grapple with are best unraveled before witnesses. The shadows here may be long, but truth does not fear the dark." He paused, his eyes glinting with a scholar's delight at the puzzle finally laid bare. "The mystery we confront is not one of brute force or impulsive malice, but of cold calculation, cloaked in the very civility we cherish. Our victim, Miss Claudia Snaith, fell not by accident, nor by the hand of a jealous sister or a concerned solicitor, but by the artifice of a man desperate to secure his own precarious standing." A glance to the far side of the room. Henry Clitheroe's restless figure wavered. "Henry Clitheroe, you bear the semblance of a man beleaguered by circumstance. Your debts are no secret, and your temper no less infamous. But it is your presence, or rather your absence at key moments, that unravels the alibi so carefully spun." Whimsy turned to a diagram laid out on the table, tracing a finger along the route from the village inn to the lane by the Snaith cottage. "You claimed to be at the inn during the morning of the incident, yet you were seen shortly before by Mrs. Clitheroe lurking near the lane. More tellingly, your return to the inn was marked by haste and agitation." The room was silent save for the crackle of burning logs. "Henry, it was you who, aware of the letter and its implications, sought to prevent Claudia from revealing the truth that would cost you dearly, that the rightful heir to the estate was not who you believed. Fear and greed compelled you to intervene." A faint flush crept over the young man's cheeks. The bonnet, torn and discarded near the scene, was a fragment of childhood possession, one you planted to misdirect suspicion toward your cousin, Lavinia. Your attempt to frame her was clever but flawed. Henry's shoulders slumped and the veneer of defiance crumbled. "I did not mean to kill her," he confessed. "I only wanted to frighten her into silence. And yet your threats became fatal." Whimsy's gaze was steady but not unkind. The altered will, the missing salver taken to suggest a staged struggle, all were pieces in your desperate game. But you overlooked the subtleties of human behavior and the immutable logic of time and place. Turning to Lavinia Barrett, Whimsy allowed a moment of gentler tone. Miss Barrett, your secret, the concealment of your sister's true identity, was a burden you bore with discretion. It was never your wish for tragedy to follow." She nodded, tears shimmering unashamedly. "To know the truth is bitter, yet liberating." Whimsy smiled faintly, his wit resurfacing. As Cicero once remarked, truth is the daughter of time, not of authority, and time, as ever, is our strictest judge. The inspector stepped forward to take Henry into custody, the weight of justice settling upon the room like the final toll of a bell. Whimsy gathered his gloves and rose. "I trust the village of Thornham will find its peace restored, though scars may linger beneath its courteous surface. The bonnet may have belonged to one sister, but the truth belongs to us all now." With a polite nod and a signature arch of his brow, Lord Peter Whimsy turned toward the door, Bunter close behind. Outside, the morning sun broke through the lingering mist, casting a pale light over the village lane, the scene of secrets, lies, and ultimately, the triumph of reason. "A case well concluded," Whimsy murmured, lighting a cigarette with impeccable flair. "Though I dare say, the human heart remains the most confounding riddle of all." And with that, the great detective's silhouette melted into the awakening day, leaving Thornham to its uneasy calm and the inexorable progress of time.